I'm here with former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and I'm excited to have a quick chat together and then take some questions from our students. Paul, we're really grateful for your leadership. During your time as Speaker of the House, you played a leading role in catalyzing pay for success legislation, impact bond legislation, and opportunity zone legislation, which is amazing. We've been chronicling the impact of opportunity zones across the country, from tribal nations in Washington State to the Teachers Village in New Jersey. Really, it's been incredible. So, two related questions for you. How did pay for success and opportunity zones measure up relative to your expectations? First part of the question. Second part is, what would you like to see happen additionally for them to really reach their potential?
Well, these are great questions. And first of all, thanks for having me here. Thanks for what you do for these causes. It's one of the things I spend a lot of my time in my post-speakership working on. Opportunity zones is something that, frankly, I'd worked on for over 20 years. I worked for Jack Kemp back in the early 90s, working on then enterprise zones. And so to see that idea to come to fruition, and we made sure that this was in the tax reform legislation, as with impact bonds. So these are things that we've been working on for many years. I saw as Speaker of the House the ability to put them in the tax reform legislation, because it's something that I'd always want to see happen, but we never had the ability to line up the political powers that be to get this done. To answer your question specifically, I think what I see as success and what is exciting, particularly with opportunity zones, is the amount of capital that has come to opportunity zones, the amount of capital that has been deployed to solve poverty problems, to be deployed in this space. The thing that I'd like to see happen, and you have to understand the way the legislation worked, the bills had to be stripped down to basically their tax consequences, the tax policy. There were always, and Tim Scott's the primary author of this bill, we always had an idea of having what I would call sort of reporting guardrails to accompany the legislation, to bring a lot of transparency to opportunity zones, to impact bonds, so that with the transparency, you can learn as you go, you can have more accountability. We could not put that in the legislation because of the Senate rules. So that is an area where I think there's room for improvement, which was always the intent. As a result of that, I think foundations, that's one of the things I work on my foundation, we can help take that role, to bring accountability and transparency, and to make sure that the mission is minded in the proper way, as we always had anticipated. But the success, particularly with opportunity zones, is the money that's being deployed. Now we are starting to see some results, and I would like to see just probably more reporting and transparency on the implementation of the policy, so that we can make sure that it's done just right. And that, to me, is something that we'd always intended, but because of the way the legislative process worked, we couldn't get done. Impact bonds, the one thing I'd like to see them deployed. So we have a great board, people I helped assemble. It's a wonderful idea. All of these ideas involve bringing private capital, private sector know-how, private sector intelligence to focusing on the problem of poverty. That, to me, and we can get into this later, is really important. And so with impact bonds, with the CIPRA, we just need to start executing and start deploying capital.
Great. I wish we had 2 hours to discuss this in more detail. But you mentioned your new foundation. I'd love if you'd spend a couple of minutes explaining your vision, where you think this can go, and compare that maybe to the impact you had in elected office. What can you do now that you might not have been able to do then? And share any lessons learned for others that might want to follow.
So I spent most of my discretionary policy making time, I focused on poverty and upward mobility. From my early days as budget chair to Ways and Means chair to being speaker, I worked on policies at the macro policymaking level and at the grassroots level to focus on reigniting upward mobility and fighting poverty and addressing root causes of poverty. And that was one of the most enjoyable policy things I ever did. And so when I retired, I wanted to make sure that the recent laws we passed, like opportunity zones, impact bonds, the Evidence Act, were well executed. And I just really enjoyed my time working on poverty issues, from what I guess I would call a center-right perspective. So the American Idea Foundation is my foundation that focuses on these issues. It focuses on research in this area. It also focuses on executing these laws properly. I teach economics at Notre Dame, and I'm on the board of the Laboratory for Economic Opportunity at Notre Dame. And I work with Notre Dame economists, and it's called LEO, along with our foundation in many areas, to really push these ideas out and get them mainstreamed and to proliferate. So the American Idea Foundation is focused on attacking poverty, new poverty solutions, and helping scale these ideas and deploy these ideas nationwide.
Great. So more on the implementation side than the policy side.
That's right.
That's fantastic. With both your background and understanding, I'm excited to see what happens next and the additional impact you'll have in this next stage as a policy impact entrepreneur. We're now going to turn to student questions, and if you would, I'd love for you to call on the first student.
Allie is next.
Hi, I'm Allie. I study film and media arts at the University of Utah. Given your experience in both the political sector and the social impact space, how can social impact policies best support communities as they seek to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a very good question, Ellie. I think obviously the need is even greater because we have spiking poverty, high unemployment, great need. So the way I look at impact bonds is it brings the best of both worlds. It brings the idea of a social public good, getting people out of poverty, fighting unique poverty problems, with private sector know-how, private sector capital. One of the concerns I've always had, and I've mentioned this for years, is in 1965 when the War on Poverty was launched, there was this great magnificent effort, well-intended, to have government tackle the issue of poverty. And it was a really well-intended, noble exercise. The downside consequence of this, in my opinion, was it pushed the private sector out of the poverty space and said, this is government space. So it told the rank and file taxpayer, the person, driving down from the suburbs to the city, driving by the projects in the blighted areas, don't worry about that. That's government's job. Just pay your taxes and government will fix this. And so we ended up marginalizing the poor. We ended up displacing the poor and not integrating the poor into our communities, into our solutions. And where we have seen so much success in America is the free enterprise system, bright minds, talented innovation, private capital working to build amazing things. That energy and capital needs to be deployed in the space of poverty. And we need to break this notion that poverty is not your problem as a citizen. It is your problem. It is your issue. And so let's get off this idea that this is just government and only government, that the private sector needs to be involved. And the private sector has so much talent and know-how that can really disrupt stale institutions that aren't producing results, which was a well-intended but sort of misguided approach to fighting poverty. And that's what I think impact bonds really basically encapsulates.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Allie.
Next is Braxton, right? Okay, I'm just going off the cue card.
Yeah, I'm Braxton. I'm studying economics at the University of Utah. The role and expectations of government have grown to encompass increased aspects of social impact. As someone who has extensive experience in national politics and the social impact space, how does each industry's role differ in the same environment, and how can they better come together to produce improved outcomes?
So just like we've seen wonderful disruption in the technology space that has brought amazing innovations and new technologies and brought people closer together, I believe we can do the same in the poverty space. And so I think the challenge for impact bonds and the challenge for this space is we are disrupting a government monopoly on fighting poverty that is sort of wedded to the status quo. My friend Bob Woodson calls it the poverty industrial complex, which is they've been doing the same thing for so long. It's been funded, and unfortunately, it's not producing the kinds of results that we need. And so we should be disrupting the poverty solution space with the kind of private sector disruptions that have made technology and other aspects so lean, so efficient, so effective, and that needs to be brought to the poverty space. But you're going to be facing a bureaucracy, entrenched interests. You're being disrupting to the status quo. And so that just takes a lot of perseverance, and it takes people coming together, and frankly, the private sector with private money, with solutions, disrupting this space. As a Catholic, I know most of you are LDS at Utah. We call it subsidiarity as Catholics. So it's a principle that basically believes bringing people together with their various talents and skills locally closest to this problem brings the best solution. And so that sense of civil society where people are working together to solve problems gets you the best outcome than phoning it in and having some big macro, Washington one-size-fits-all bureaucratic approach. So that to me is what impact bonds and impact solutions, CIPRA represents, that kind of philosophy.
Thank you for that.
Perry, right?
Yeah. Hi, Mr. Ryan.
Hi.
So I'm Perry Brimley. I'm a senior at the University of Utah studying economics. And in your experience, what is the biggest challenge the advancement of social impact policy faces in our country? And how can organizations like the Sorenson Impact Center make a substantial difference?
I think it's telling the story, breaking through the bureaucracy, as I mentioned before, which is you're breaking through the status quo and you're challenging the status quo. And there is just this entrenched belief that this is solely government space and not the private sector's space, and that nothing could be farther from the truth. And the challenge with impact bonds is getting them deployed, getting them understood, but bringing sort of the rigorous private sector type solutions to solving problems, focusing on metrics. I think the best thing here is the objective is evidence-based policymaking. The objective is results-based policymaking. And the entire premise of the war on poverty from the government's point of view was focusing on effort and focusing on inputs. How much money are we spending? How many programs are we creating? How much bureaucracy are we building? And that was sort of the measurement of success. The whole philosophy behind impacts, behind the Sorenson Center, as I understand it, and our foundation is focusing on results. What achieves the end goal of reigniting upward mobility, attacking root causes of poverty and getting people out of poverty. And by orienting or disrupting all of this effort to be focused not on inputs, not on effort, but on outcomes and results, changes our entire attitude and changes the way we approach these problems. That is disruptive. That changes the status quo for the better, in my opinion. But nevertheless, it is always challenging when you're changing, a generation-long status quo.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's exactly a combination of those two things, using markets, market principles, private sector to catalyze measurable results, data-driven, measurable results.
And data-driven, measurable results tells a politician the thing that you created in law, the ribbon cutting that you did, the fame that you got, the press release you put out may not be the right solution. And we're going to go find solutions where the solutions actually exist. And that is hard to put your fingers around. And more importantly, it does de-emphasize government. The way I look at this is government shouldn't be manning the front lines in the war on poverty. It should man the supply lines. It should bring resources. It should bring resources like money and other things. But the people in the communities, on the ground, learning from one another, using time-tested principles and processes are the ones who actually man the front lines in the war on poverty and create the solutions. And that is different kind of thinking from the government-centric approach.
Let's see, who do we have next here?
Okay, Zach, right?
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm currently a junior at the University of Utah, majoring in political science and international studies. So as you know, asset-based community development is a concept that focuses on the individuals in that community and uses their skills and strengths that they already offer to help build a better foundation for long-term growth. So my question to you is, how is the private sector working with local governments to create positive change, starting with the individuals in that community? And what steps are being taken to ensure that corporations are not abusing opportunity zones for tax breaks?
That's a really good question. So I'll take the easiest part first, which is the whole premise of impact bonds was to bring the fusion of the public sector and the private sector together to try and find an evidence-based practices for solving a problem, and then scaling up the solutions when we find good solutions so that we can replicate those solutions. So to me, it's a perfect integration of private sector capital, private sector know-how, market-based solutions with the government to try and achieve a shared goal and objective. And that is the whole premise behind it. And yes, it's disruptive of the government monopoly on poverty solutions. The opportunity zone question is a really good one. This is something that we're focused on as well at the American Idea Foundation, as I know you are as well, which is how do you police the idea so it doesn't get abused? Because I think the left would like nothing more, and I don't mean to be partisan, but I think there's an ideological issue here. They would like nothing more to say, this is just a tax abuse shelter, let's get rid of the idea. So I really believe more transparency in reporting gets you more accountability. again, that's a part of the law that we wanted to have in law, but we couldn't because of it's something called the Byrd Rule. So that is why I think we're working on some accountability tools to rate and measure opportunity zones so that they mine the mission. And the mission here in opportunity zones is the person who put it in the tax code is not to regentrify communities and push the poor out. It's to revitalize communities. It is to bring jobs. It is to bring solutions. It is to reintegrate civil society so that the people in these blighted neighborhoods and these blighted communities in rural and inner city America are actually rising out of poverty. And so we want to make sure that the funds and the zones themselves understand the totality of the mission. And we want people to make money. We want people to invest. But we also want them to understand the reason this law exists in the first place. So in my opinion, transparency from reporting brings you more accountability as to the best zones to invest in and the best zones that are worth copying and replicating.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Measurement and reporting is really key to all this.
it really is.
For opportunity zones to succeed into the future.
I very much look forward to working with you on that.
We have a whole data analytics team that we can bring in to be a part of that.
Fantastic. I think we've got one more. We have Brian coming.
My name is Brian Pham, and I'm currently a junior studying marketing. So my question is, an essential part of working within the social impact space is bringing together people with diverse backgrounds, voices, and ideologies. In your opinion, what are ways that social impact leaders can build better bridges across differences?
I love this question. This question is, I think this is one of the most important questions. My own experience, obviously I'm a conservative. I have my own political ideology and views. And I found myself, when I spent a lot of time working in the poverty space in government, in Congress, having these ideological impasses. I remember trying to, reform the Social Security Disability Program, just running into these ideological barriers. And what ends up happening is you have political ideological stalemates and nothing gets done. And this gave me an idea. I actually was talking to an economist at Harvard named Raj Chetty, who did this amazing study on upward mobility in early education. And I went to some friends of mine who I now work with at the University of Notre Dame, some economists there, a guy named Jim Sullivan, and talked about Raj Chetty. He said, wouldn't it be nice if we could get data like Raj Chetty get and do this in the entire poverty space? And couldn't we have an evidence-based conversation on data and what works best versus ideology? So the economist said, you should do a commission on this. So I went to one of my closest friends in the Democratic Party, a senator from Washington State named Patty Murray. She and I had done a budget deal before. And I said, Patty, let's build a commission to try and launch a new field of social science called evidence-based policymaking so that we can use data and analysis and analytics and random clinical trials to figure out how to solve some of these problems that are just tied up in ideological fights so that we can sort of leapfrog the political impasses and go with where the data shows us the best way to go. As a conservative, I always thought our principles would be validated. And if they're not, then maybe I should think about the premise of my beliefs. So she and I created this commission, which basically met and determined how do you release all the government data on government programs like poverty programs in a privacy compliant way. We took that commission's results, we put it into law, it got signed into law in the beginning of January of 2019. It is now being deployed. This is what our foundation with the Sorenson Center is working on. And so we believe we have helped launch a new practice in political science that I like to refer to as this evidence-based policymaking, where we use data and analysis and analytics to solve problems and find out what works best and what doesn't, so that we can make policy design and funding decisions not based on political patronage or political ideology or who's in power and who's not, but what works and what doesn't work. And there was 1% of all federal poverty programs were done this way. MCFI, actually, 1%. So we really believe we can transform the nearly $1 trillion the federal government spends on fighting poverty to moving that money to what actually works and what is effective. And it helps you leapfrog the political ideological fights and focus on just effectiveness and data. And so that my career tells me, yeah, I love ideology. I love political fights, but more often than not, it ends up with stalemate. So if we can just get past that and focus on what works, because people on both sides of the aisle, we want to fight poverty. We want people to stop being poor and to grow and rise out of poverty. So let's have a debate about the analysis about how best to affect it and go with where the evidence takes us. And that's why we did this law. And that, in my opinion, is the best way to overcome these barriers.
Thank you so much.
I love that. Evidence and data as a way of bridging the ideological divide.
Totally. And it does work. It does. I've seen many instances in public policy debates where if you are equipped with unassailable data and evidence, people put the boxing gloves down.
Right.
They put the sharp edges on ideology down, and you can have a really nice centrist-based kind of conversation about what works and what doesn't. MCFE is the perfect example. MCFE, it's a long acronym, but it's basically nurses going into homes of poor moms on a prenatal basis, helping them get prepared for motherhood, for having an infant, health, welfare, and it was rigorously designed by the Bush administration with an evidence-based reporting focus. Bush created it, Obama extended it, and Trump reauthorized it. Because this law, getting nurses into the poor communities, we had such good evidence that Bush, Obama, and Trump all supported this law. And now it's being deployed nationwide.
That's a perfect example of a meta application of a micro principle I found so often in my life. When people are having strong differences of opinion, they're just arguing from a different set of facts. And so if you can get everybody on the same page data-wise, then everything else becomes easier, and it becomes about implementation and everything else. Well, what do you think of our students?
They're not Wisconsin fans, so I won't hold that against them. But they're brilliant. They're wonderful questions. And what's your slogan? What do you say? I mean, we say "Go Badgers," on Wisconsin. What's your?
Go Utes.
Go you. Go you. Oh, that's so close. This is us. Wisconsin. So you guys are so close. Thank you, University of Wisconsin. So close. Easy to collaborate here. Wonderful.
Again, we really appreciate your leadership and your example, your entrepreneurial example to drive for impact. And in recognition of that, we would like to name you, this is not just a centerpiece, this is an award.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
We would like to name you a
very
Sorenson
cool.
Impact Fellow.
Thank
Paul
you.
Ryan, for your great leadership.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Can we get a
Thank you
picture,
very
Brian?
much. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, can you see it? You can't even tell we're smiling, can you?
You can see it in the eyes.
Okay.
Yeah, you definitely learn how to read eyes better these days, don't you?
right.
Yeah, wonderful.
Well, thank you. Really.
Well, thank you.
For your time here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.